Kyle was desperate. Rebecca wasn't responding, and none of the other pilots knew whether she had survived the air collision or not. Both fighter jets had fallen from the sky at incredible speed. Kyle checked his screen again, but the red dot representing Rebecca's aircraft had vanished. He choked back tears. He knew that calling out to her over the radio was useless. He debated what to do next. He was the captain of his squadron, and he was responsible for the lives of 20 other pilots battling it out in the air. He knew he couldn't just abandon them to search for Rebecca. He cursed himself for having allowed her to stay and fight in the war, and he wished he would have convinced her to stay at home with her family where she would have been safe. He couldn't believe that after all they had gone through, it had ended like that. He couldn't even imagine how frightened she must have been when she had seen Blaze's aircraft falling from the sky directly above her. He shook his head, wishing he could have protected her somehow. He didn't have much time to think about it, however, since the Red Eagles were close on their heels. Kyle was more determined than ever to give their opponents a run for their money. Blaze was out of the picture, and without their leader, the other pilots weren't nearly as brave. Kyle and his team quickly destroyed several enemy aircraft in succession. The remaining pilots made several fatal mistakes, and they were soon eliminated too. It was a bittersweet victory for Kyle's squadron after losing 3 of their own pilots. For the first time in his flying career, Kyle wasn't looking forward to returning to the base, afraid of the news that would greet him. He had no choice, however, so he turned his plane around and headed back. As he approached, he could see the charred remains of the city in the distance. The area was covered in smoke rising from collapsed buildings, and piles of concrete lined the streets. It appeared to have been an intense battle, but Chile had emerged as the obvious victor. When Kyle landed his fighter jet on the tarmac, Leroy, one of the squadron members, was already waiting to pick him up in his car. Leroy slapped him on the back enthusiastically. "Captain, what an amazing battle! You made us proud. You won't believe who we just captured." He didn't seem to notice the dejected look on Kyle's face. "Blaze, the Red Eagle's captain, crashed and burned. He ejected from his plane and landed not far from here with his parachute. We got him before he could get away, though. He's quite the character. Do you want to go and see him?" Kyle was stunned. "Did you happen to see another aircraft? His fighter jet crashed into one of ours in midair." Leroy shook his head, confused. "What about the female pilot?" Kyle demanded. "The pretty woman who also works with the medical team. Did you see her?" It was then that Leroy noticed how distraught Kyle was. It was obvious he had been crying, and his voice was hoarse. He shook his head apologetically. "I'm sorry, Captain. We didn't see anyone except for Blaze. Was she the pilot of the other fighter jet that crashed? Did she survive?" Kyle didn't answer. He jumped into the car with a determined look on his face. "She's got to be around here somewhere. I'm gonna go find her." Kyle drove around the battlegrounds at full speed, desperately searching for signs of Rebecca. He was so careless that he almost drove into a ditch, but he managed to swerve at the very last second. After an hour or two, it occurred to him that she may have returned to the base if she was still alive. So he drove back, slammed on the brakes in front of the main tent, and jumped out of the car. Zach went over to him with an excited look on his face. "Kyle, did you hear? Blaze has been captured. What do you think we should do with him?" Kyle shrugged. "Keep him as a prisoner of war. He's quite valuable to the Peruvians, so we can leverage him. If it were up to me, though, I'd strangle him with my bare hands." After leaving Zach staring at him, Kyle took out his phone to locate Rebecca. He remembered she always wore the tracker bracelet he had given her. He was shocked to discover that her current location was in Peru, a few dozen miles away from the border. He refreshed the tracking app to make sure there was no mistake, but it displayed the same location a second time. Just then, the team responsible for cleaning up the debris on the battlefield returned to the base. Kyle approached them and asked if they had seen Rebecca's aircraft. They shook their heads and told him they had only found the remains of the other 3 aircraft that had been destroyed by the enemy. After that, Kyle walked over to the area where the medical team was camped. He spoke to the supervisor there. "I'd like to borrow a skilled doctor from your team. One of my pilots has been injured, and they need medical assistance. The supervisor nodded. George can go with you. He has a lot of experience. He waved to a middle-aged doctor, and he introduced him to Kyle. One of my pilot's planes crashed, and she's on the other side of the border, Kyle quickly explained. It may be difficult to cross into enemy territory. If you feel that it's too dangerous and you don't want to go, I'll understand. I can find someone else. The doctor shook his head. It's okay. I'm used to dangerous situations, and I've been in plenty of battles. I'll go with you, Captain. It's an honor to serve you, after what you accomplished earlier today. As far as I'm concerned, you and your pilots are all heroes. Kyle smiled graciously and gave him a military salute. Thank you. Let's get going then. He knew George was aware of what it meant to cross the border. They could be captured by the enemy, or, even worse, shot dead. He respected the medic for agreeing to such a dangerous mission. They didn't waste any more time and quickly climbed into the car. Zach, who knew what had happened to Rebecca's aircraft, offered to join them. Kyle shook his head. No, you're not part of this battle. It's too risky. Stay here. Zach was disappointed, but he accepted his decision. Okay, just be careful and bring Rebecca back as soon as you can. Just as Kyle and George were about to drive away, Leroy opened the back door of the car and got in. You're not going anywhere without me. Kyle shrugged and started the car. It was already dark by the time they left the base. Kyle followed the tracking app on his phone. Rebecca's location was still the same. His heart sank. He didn't dare think about what that meant. Less than an hour later, they arrived at the border, which was occupied by the Peruvian military. Kyle was careful to avoid enemy encampments, and he drove slowly to avoid attracting attention. He could hear the sound of gunfire in the distance, but it was too late, and most of the troops had already gone to sleep. From afar, Kyle could see the lights from the tower. They were powerful enough to light up all the checkpoints on the border, and he knew that those towers contained armed guards. If Kyle had arrived in a fighter plane, he would have found it easier to cross the border, but he hadn't been sure about their radar system and air defense. He knew from his recent interaction with the Red Eagle Squadron and the confrontations of the previous few days that using a fighter jet to charge straight into the other side's territory would be more difficult than passing through safely on the ground. He also knew that the speed of the fighter plane wouldn't allow him to locate Rebecca's position from the air. He glanced back at Leroy. Get ready. We're going to go for it. Leroy touched his gun and nodded. Kyle increased his speed. He managed to go 50 yards or so when a light landed on his car. The border guards very quickly aimed in their direction. Kyle put his foot to the floor as the sound of gunfire tore through the night sky. Bullets began to land on the off-road vehicle. Because of the war, almost all of the ground troops were stationed at the front line. The sentries were somewhat more relaxed in their position at the border, and there weren't a lot of them, but there were enough to make life difficult. Leroy pressed George down and started shooting through the window at the exterior of the tower. Kyle's gaze was locked in front of him, but he used his peripheral vision and ears to make constant adjustments to his route. The bullets were coming thick and fast, and Kyle knew that he couldn't let their opponents blow up the tires. They were going so fast that they were almost flying, and he was trying to avoid any sort of patterns to the car's movements, but the modified car's body was soon molded and embedded with bullets. There was a loud bang as they crossed the borderline. A bullet had managed to penetrate the window on Kyle's side, and it shattered into thousands of pieces. The bullet went into the seat behind Kyle. Leroy broke out in a cold sweat, but his hands didn't stop moving. They made it over the border and out of range of the sentries, but they could hear the sound of several engines behind them. The opposition had been relaxed and resting. They weren't running on adrenaline as Kyle, who had been in battle after battle, was. The Peruvian army had been provoked, though, and they weren't going to make life easy for the interlopers. Gunshots were being fired haphazardly. A bullet hit the rearview mirror, and Kyle suddenly had no vision behind him. He knew that there was no way to back out of the madness and decided that continuing forward was the only way. He trusted Leroy to be his eyes at the back while he locked onto Rebecca's position and drove on at breakneck speed. The car behind him refused to give up. Leroy shouted instructions from the back. Left! Kyle quickly drifted to the left and dodged a bullet that had been aimed at the tire. As he turned back to the right, he suddenly heard a muffled groan. He inhaled sharply and turned abruptly to look in the back seat. He saw Leroy with his hand on his chest. Blood was spreading quickly over his camouflage t-shirt. Kyle's heart was in his throat, and he found himself unable to make a sound. Leroy clutched his chest. It's nothing. Keep going. I won't die. Kyle knew that he couldn't give in to his emotions, and he continued forward. The gunfire was coming from all directions. The two cars behind him were getting closer, so Kyle braked suddenly. The two cars went past him, and he quickly fired shots at the driver of one of them. Leroy gritted his teeth through the pain and did the same thing. Kyle's bullet was a direct hit. The driver slumped forward without a sound, but the car continued on at high speed. He shot again. The driver's tire suddenly exploded, and the car lost control of its spin and crashed into the other one. As the two cars rolled, Kyle studied the angles and blew up the fuel tank on one of them. His bullet created an instant flame, and it only took a couple of seconds for the whole thing to explode. Kyle spun his own car quickly to retreat, but they couldn't escape the effect of the explosion. He felt the wave of energy rushing in from the broken window. There are still two more cars, Leroy said anxiously. Let George treat you immediately. I'll handle the rest. Leroy couldn't hold on any longer. His forehead was covered in sweat, and blood kept flowing from his wound. He did as Kyle had asked. George moved quickly. He treated the wound very efficiently, and then took up the position behind the gun to help Kyle. The fire in front of them was so big, so Kyle floored it again to get through. They had managed to leave the other vehicles behind, but as soon as they were about to sigh with relief, a few more cars appeared in front of them. Kyle felt he couldn't breathe. For the first time in his life, he felt powerless. But Rebecca was still waiting for him, and she had been for a long time. Her location hadn't changed at all. When Leroy climbed into the front passenger seat and saw the cars in front of them, his eyes widened in horror. What should we do? Kyle continued to look straight ahead as he spat out his reply. Keep charging through. It was a clash of titans, and Kyle didn't know how far he could push. His entire world seemed filled with gunshots, and the car was at its limits. The tires were rubbing against the ground, creating sparks. He could smell the burned rubber. Black smoke came from under the hood, but he ignored it. He held the steering wheel with his left hand and raised his gun with his right hand to fight back. The car windows were all broken, and the doors were riddled with holes, and they were bumping along on worn wheels. Their vehicle was no longer safe in any way. Leroy shouted something. His eyes were bloodshot, and blood was flowing out of his mouth, but he was smiling. We made it! They were just passing the last car when a stray bullet made its way inside. Kyle had seen the shot and had turned the wheel to take evasive action, but the car was falling apart, and he was losing control. He was appalled to see the bullet pass through the space where the windshield had been and pierce Leroy's left chest. Kyle held his breath. Beside him, Leroy's expression froze, but excitement still shone in his eyes. It was only then that Kyle realized that Leroy had more holes in him. He had been shot in the abdomen, as well as having taken 2 to the chest. Kyle, we need to keep moving. Rebecca is still waiting for us. Leroy's voice was unsteady and weak, so his words all but blew away with the wind. Kyle was angry. He let off 7 or 8 rounds at the person who had shot Leroy so cold-bloodedly. The person had been the only remaining survivor of the car chase, but his body was turned into a sieve after Kyle's onslaught. Kyle gripped the steering wheel tightly and moved forward as quickly as the car would go. Beside him, Leroy's eyes had already closed. His blood was flowing freely down his body and onto the seat. Over the half hour that followed, Kyle had a few more sporadic encounters with members of the opposing group, but they were easily scared off with a short exchange of gunfire. They drove on until they reached the edge of the desert. Kyle saw that Rebecca was still about 10 miles further on. Before he drove the car into the desert, he assessed the road conditions. It was often windy in the desert, and he knew that the roads wouldn't be easy to find and follow. The car hadn't been made for the desert, and although it had been modified in some ways, it was difficult to drive over the sandy ground. Half an hour later, they were finally close to Rebecca's position. The sky was dark and gloomy, but looking around, he guessed that it was almost dawn. Under the headlights, they could see that the desert was full of dips and mounds. It was quiet and beautiful, but also lifeless. As he got closer, Kyle had never felt more nervous. He turned and looked at his brother in arms, who had already been sacrificed for the cause. Kyle found breathing painful. It was almost as if the air he had been inhaling was filled with sand that was rushing into his lungs. It was then that the black outline appeared. He recognized it straight away as a fighter plane. He suspected that it was the one Rebecca had piloted. The outline gradually became clearer as they got closer, and he was stoked to see her number on it. "I found her." As he finished speaking, he gave a solemn military salute to his compatriot who had lost his life. He got out of the car and opened the back door. "George, His words suddenly stuck at that point. In the back seat, George was still sitting upright. However, a bullet had gone through his head, and he hadn't even had time to close his eyes. Kyle's body swayed, and he felt as if his heart had been ripped apart. The pain spread through his entire body and ended with him feeling cold to his bones. He swallowed hard and took 2 steps back. He performed another military salute and used what remained of his strength to tear himself away. He moved toward the cabin of the fighter jet. The headlights of the car shone on the aircraft, and he could see Rebecca quietly leaning back against the seat. Her eyes were tightly shut, and her entire body was covered in blood. He wasn't sure if the hatch was stuck or not, but he couldn't open it. He used tools to pry it open as far as he could. Rebecca didn't react at all to what he was doing, and he had never been so afraid. He carefully lifted her out of the cabin and carried her as though she were made of fragile porcelain. Her body was cold, and her face showed nothing. She didn't even open her eyes when he moved her, and blood flowed from the corner of her mouth. Kyle was living his biggest fear. He cradled her and looked at the dark sky while he shouted at the top of his lungs. He sounded like a wounded beast as he wailed. He was filled with sorrow. Dawn hadn't yet poked its head over the horizon, and the sky was still dark. Kyle trembled as he looked down at Rebecca to assess her injuries. He was surprised to discover that there was nothing obvious. He took a deep breath and carefully examined her again. She didn't have any injuries that he could find, but she had lost quite a bit of blood. He was pretty sure he knew what that meant. He wasn't a doctor. The only doctor that had been with him had just lost his life. All he knew was that he couldn't find a pulse. It was too far from where they were to camp, and it was possible that they would be killed before they reached it. He held her gently and touched her cheek with his fingertip. Her eyes were tightly shut. The blood on the right side of her mouth had flowed when he had lifted her, but the blood on the left side had already dried up. His trembling finger landed on her carotid artery. When he couldn't feel anything, tears cascaded down his face. He hugged her to him in pain and despair. "Don't leave me. Rebecca, you can't leave." He knew how to fly a plane, go into battle, deal with obvious injuries, and even hack into a computer network. What he didn't know was how to treat a person who had internal injuries and was on the brink of death. He couldn't stop the tears as he carried her to the car. He opened the medical kit and found basic supplies for patching up external wounds. The only thing to be taken internally was a bottle of glucose. He bit off the lid and poured it into her mouth. Some of it mixed with the blood and trickled back out, but he knew that a decent amount of it had gotten in. Her clothes were wet, but she wasn't aware of any of that. She just lay unmoving in his arms, and she wasn't breathing. Kyle's vision was blurred. He wiped the tears off his face and thought of what he could do to save her. He looked up at the dark sky. The stars in the desert were known to be beautiful, and at that moment, far away from the battlefield, the sky was stunningly lit up. Kyle pointed at the 3 stars in the sky that were connected and spoke to Rebecca. "Look, the 3 stars that you like are still there, even in this faraway land." Rebecca didn't respond. Her body was cool, and the coldness penetrated through to his soul. His voice felt ridiculously hoarse. He linked his fingers through Rebecca's and clasped them tightly. He was careful not to use all his strength because she felt so fragile, and he was afraid that she would shatter. He tried to coax her back to life. "Becky, open your eyes for me. Tell me how I can save you. I need to know what you know." He regretted his lack of knowledge in the area of medicine. He had found her, only to watch helplessly as her life slowly ebbed away. There was nothing he could do. Rebecca couldn't give him any answers. There was nothing and no one around them to give him support. Everything was quiet, without even a breath of wind. The lack of sound only highlighted the fact that Kyle couldn't hear any breathing sounds from Rebecca. He swallowed heavily as he saw a future without any color. A ray of light suddenly appeared in the distance. It wasn't bright, but it was enough to outline the contours of the desert. Daylight came quickly in the desert, and it wasn't long before everything was lit up by the sun. Kyle looked down at Rebecca again. "Look, it's dawn." The light revealed the layers and contours in the surrounding area. The rising and falling sand dunes were outlined by a beautiful arc. Tiny bits of light danced on the sand. A gust of wind chose that moment to arrive, and Kyle raised his hand to block the sand from hitting Rebecca's face. As he let go of her hand, it fell lifelessly to the ground. He felt as if he had been physically struck when he realized what that meant. He grabbed her hand again, and his eyes blurred with more tears. He watched them fall onto the sand and quickly disappear. He choked on his words as he begged her to be okay. "Rebecca, wake up! Please, don't sleep. Didn't you say that you still have a lot to learn when it comes to flying? I'll teach you. You said the probation period was too short, so tell me, how long do you want it to be? I don't care how long it is, as long as you open your eyes. I've always wanted to introduce my sister to you, but I never had the time to make it happen. When we get home, I'll take you to see her. And there's one more thing that I want to tell you." He paused for a moment and put his face close to hers. "I liked you already when we were kids. I thought you were beautiful, like a crystal doll. When you got older, I always wanted to take you back home with me. At first, I liked you because you were beautiful. You're mischievous, kind, and brave." He lowered his head further and kissed her blood-stained face. "I love you so much, Rebecca." As he spoke, the newly risen sun played over her skin, and it gave her a golden hue. Her hair was messy, and her lips were dry, but she was still the most beautiful woman to him. He felt as though his heart was breaking into 2, and he suddenly couldn't say anything more. He looked up slowly and noticed her plane again. One wing was almost buried in the sand. Kyle knew how it had been engineered. He had chosen that model because he had known that they would be in a desert battle. The airplane's engine was so close to the top so that when it took off in the desert, it wouldn't suck a large amount of sand into the engine. He realized that if he fixed the plane, he could fly her to safety. "Don't you love the blue sky, Becky? Let's fly together again." He thought it likely that they would find themselves under fire, but as she was already showing no signs of life, he was prepared to take the risk and die with her. He kissed her again and felt instantly calmer. He placed her carefully on a sand dune and went to repair the plane. As he did so, a small bottle rolled out from her pocket. Kyle took a look at it and discovered that it was the medicine that Dr. Shananahan had given her. He was going to put it back in her pocket, but the light shone through the bottle to reveal 3 small pills lying at the bottom. He shook it in the sun and realized that the design on the bottle was unique. The 3 pills were isolated from the powder by a thin film. When Kyle thought of Dr. Shananahan and his medicine, a faint glimmer of hope suddenly flared within him. He looked at his phone and found there was no signal at all. He couldn't see any other avenue, so he threw caution to the wind and opened the bottle of medicine Dr. Shananahan had given Rebecca. 3 red pills rolled onto his palm. He opened Rebecca's mouth and fed them to her. She didn't make any attempts to swallow, so he bent over and kissed her on the lips. He gently pried open her mouth and used the tip of his tongue to press the 3 pills toward the back of her throat. The scent of blood was strong, and his heart ached for her. He picked up the bottle of glucose, filled his mouth with it, and fed it to her in the same way. It was slow going and felt like a desperate measure to be taking. It wasn't the way he always imagined kissing her, but it was all he had. When he had finished, he carefully laid her back down and went to repair the plane. It had been a long time since he had slept, and he felt weak as he got up. He steeled himself to put in one last big effort, and, using his hand to block the glare from the sun, he walked toward the aircraft. He studied the wreckage and pieced together what Rebecca had experienced. She had clearly used her smarts. She had lost control, and her parachute was damaged, but she had been able to control the direction of the plane's descent. The navigation system was broken, and he wondered how early on that had happened. He suspected that it would have been a terrifying experience. He hated the thought of her having been so afraid, and vowed to always be by her side from that point. He wasn't fussed about fixing the navigation system, but he didn't really need it. But he knew that he had to deal with the engine problem. He didn't care where he flew, he just wanted to take her up into the blue sky. He kept an eye on Rebecca as he worked, but he still couldn't discern any movement or signs of life. The temperature had risen, and his eyes blurred with sweat, but he wiped it away and carried on. He knew that the only way forward was to stay calm. He had no help, and knew that the day was only going to get hotter. He spoke to Rebecca as he worked, and told her when he was about to test the engine. "It's almost ready." He never expected her to answer, and her eyes remained shut. At the same time, back in Chile, Reggie was keeping an eye on the wounded continually being brought in. He was getting more and more tense. He eventually saw a young soldier wearing an Air Force uniform, and he quickly ran up to him. "Did Rebecca make it back?" His heart sank as he saw the soldier's expression. "What happened to her?" The soldier shook his head sadly and sighed. "Her plane fell. It landed within the borders of Peru, and our captain went to find her." Reggie grabbed the soldier's arm. "Where exactly did that happen? What do you mean by her plane fell? Would she have been able to jump out in time?" The soldier shrugged. "I don't know. Captain Gonzalez went to look for her, but there's still no news." "Is that Kyle?" The soldier nodded. "Can you help me contact him?" Reggie asked. The soldier took out his phone and called Kyle. Reggie waited quietly but anxiously for the result of the call. His heart pounded against his chest. His whole body was covered in a cold sweat, and there was no color in his face. Almost immediately, the soldier shook his head. "His phone has no signal." Reggie was already turning away. "I'm going to borrow a car." The soldier tried to stop him. "He's in Peru. You need to cross the border, and it'd be very dangerous." Reggie didn't care and was set to continue until he was accosted by an international medic. The medic rushed over to him with a phone. "Excuse me, are you Reggie?" He nodded, and the man handed the phone to him. "Someone's on the line for you." Reggie was confused as to why someone would be looking for him, but he answered anyway. It was a young male voice that spoke. It was somewhat familiar and sounded cool and measured. "Reggie, it's Bruno." Reggie was momentarily shocked, but he reacted quickly. "What is it?" "I saw Layla yesterday and sent her safely out of the country. Before she left, she asked me to help her find you to make sure you were safe." Reggie frowned. "Are you on the battlefield too? When will she be home?" After Reggie had taken the 2 pilots to the medical tent, he had borrowed a phone to call home, but Layla hadn't answered. He had also called Oliver, who he had discovered was in the hospital. Oliver had injured his leg and was looking at another week before it was recovered enough to move. "They should be there in 2 hours. Her plane will arrive at the airport in Havana in an hour and a half. Bruno paused. I'm fighting in the war. It was my people who sent her back. Thank you. Reggie paused for a thought. Where are you? Peru. Bruno didn't bother to hide that fact. He knew that Layla would tell her family at some point. When Reggie heard that Bruno was in Peru, his heart leaped and everything else went out of his head. Can you help me with one thing? If I can. Bruno believed in being concise. Do you remember Rebecca Gates? She's in Peru, and you might be able to help me save her. Bruno frowned. Why is she in Peru? Was she captured? He continued without waiting for an answer. Give me the coordinates. I'll send someone to help her. He knew that Rebecca had joined the U.S. Army. He also knew that Peru and Chile were at war. The U.S. was supporting Chile. I don't know the exact location. Her plane went down during battle. I heard that she landed somewhere near the border, but we can't contact her. Bruno knew right away what to do. He knew that the war was largely being fought on the ground and that the sky was a mess. He was also quite sure that she wouldn't have been too far over the border. All right, he said. I'll get on to it immediately. He thought back to the times that he had been bullied. It was Rebecca who had saved him and given him the unique itching powder that ensured his bullies never came back to bother him again. Other than Zoe and Layla, Rebecca was the only other person who had treated him well. Okay, thank you. Reggie finally felt that he could fully exhale. In the desert, Kyle had managed to fix the engine so he could fly the plane. He didn't know how far the plane would get him, how long it would stay in the air, or whether they would be shot down on the way. But he didn't care about any of that at that point. He returned to Rebecca's side, bent over, and gently picked her up. We're going for another plane ride. Rebecca seemed tiny to Kyle as he picked her up. She felt as light as a feather as he strode toward the plane. He continued to keep her informed of his movements. I'll put you in first, and then I'll say goodbye to the other two. He opened the cabin door, gently placed Rebecca on the seat, and kissed her on the forehead. I came with Leroy and George to pick you up. Do you know them? Leroy was deployed for ground fighting. I think we sat across from him once in the canteen. Kyle continued his steady stream of chatter. And George. He came with me because he heard that a life was on the line. He knew the dangers, but he came anyway, without hesitation. He choked on his words and forced a smile. I dragged them into this and failed to protect them. Not only did I fail them, but I don't know how to save you. Kyle took a deep breath and ran his hand over her hair. It was full of sweat, blood, and sand. He tried to comb it out with his fingers and braided it as best he could. He then took a towel from the car and dipped it in water and wiped her face clean. She looked better, but she was still motionless. Her face was pale, as were her lips. Kyle looked at her and felt bitter about the way their lives had gone. He tried his best to control his emotions and kissed her on the cheek before he went back to the car. As he dug 2 deep pits in the desert sand, he wondered how many soldiers had been buried in similar ways. He took a blood-stained badge from Leroy's uniform pocket and a medical cross badge from George's. He stared at them for a few seconds before carefully putting them away for later. He then lowered both men into their makeshift graves. The yellow sand quickly covered their bodies, and he knew that in time, the wind would ensure that no evidence was left of their resting place. The sun was already high in the sky, and it was burning Kyle's skin, but he stayed long enough to salute his fellow soldiers. He washed his hands and headed back to Rebecca in the plane cabin. Let's go. He leaned in close to make sure that she was still comfortable. As he did so, he noticed a fresh tear at the corner of her eye. His breathing suddenly stopped, and his entire body felt frozen. He thought back to the way that she had been positioned earlier and realized that she had moved slightly. When he had left her in the seat, she had been facing forward, but her head had moved so that she was facing the graves he had just filled. Does she know? He wondered. Is she awake? He felt his hands trembling. He was unsure whether he should touch her, so he made do with gently brushing her cheek with his hand as he tried to form a coherent sentence. "Rebecca, you woke up. You're awake. Are you? Did you hear what I said?" In those few seconds, he felt more nervous than he ever had before. His eyes locked tightly onto Rebecca's face. He held his breath and didn't dare to move. He was on tenter hooks as he watched her, but he eventually saw her eyes flutter in the sunlight. The movement was minuscule, but it was enough to allay his deepest fear. Kyle stayed where he was in front of the cabin door and left his hand resting on Rebecca's cheek. After the slight movement of her eyes, he noticed another tear leaking from the corner of her eye. It landed gently on his palm. The dam burst for Kyle as he lost control of his tightly constrained emotions. He gently pulled her into his embrace and buried his head in her hair. Tears rolled unchecked down his face. His voice was so choked by emotion that he could barely get his words out. "I knew you wouldn't leave me. I knew you wouldn't do that to me. You're back, right? And you won't leave me again." He kept babbling because he had never been so happy, nervous, excited, or scared before. Rebecca didn't want to cause any more worry. She used all her strength to speak softly. "Yes." Her voice was as quiet as a desert breeze, but Kyle heard it. He knelt on the sand dune and cradled her to him. He lost track of time, but when he felt the heat of the sun getting stronger, he snapped back to reality and moved her out of the plane. He put her in the shade of the aircraft and helped her ingest more of the sugary water. He fed her, sip by sip. Rebecca still couldn't open her eyes. She had already used up all her strength by speaking. As her body came back online, her body's senses kicked in, and she realized that she was in unbearable pain. Her entire body hurt. She didn't know what to do. She couldn't open her eyes or speak. She was aware that Kyle was looking at her, but the details were hazy. She felt like she was in a trance and wasn't sure if Kyle had been crying. She then wondered if he had been crying for her or his fallen compatriots. Vague thoughts crossed her mind like a montage and then became more chaotic as she moved forward toward full consciousness. The sun had already set by the time she was fully alert. The setting sun created the most beautiful colored clouds, and even the sand seemed to have a particularly attractive hue. As Rebecca's vision focused and things became clearer, she saw a familiar face, but she had never seen Kyle in such a state. He was unshaven, his hair was oily and standing on end, and his eyes were bloodshot with dark circles underneath. It was the eyes that surprised her the most. He seemed like a cardboard cutout of the man she knew. His demeanor changed as soon as she opened her eyes. His eyes suddenly shone brightly, and he seemed instantly energized. His voice also sounded hoarse and scratchy. "Becky, you're awake. How do you feel? Are you uncomfortable?" Her lips moved, but she couldn't make a sound. Kyle saw that she was trying. "You don't need to say anything. I'm thinking of a way to get out of here. Just rest, and I'll get you some water to drink." Rebecca's eyelids fluttered again as she tried to focus. She summoned the strength to reach out and grab hold of his uniform. With that one movement, she had grabbed not only his uniform, but his heart as well. He cleared his throat. "Is there something you want to say? What is it?" Rebecca blinked. She wanted to speak, but she had no strength. Her body was so weak that it felt like she had no bones. She could only lean into Kyle and rest. Kyle saw the movement as a positive. "Don't worry, I'll get you some more water. It might give you the strength to speak." He took some bottled water from the car and fed it to her in the same way that he had earlier when she had been unable to do it herself. Rebecca wanted to say that she could actually drink it herself, but she couldn't. She could only accept his help. When half the bottle was gone, she felt the urge to go to the toilet quite strongly. She grabbed his uniform again and shook it with as much force as she could muster. Kyle didn't understand. He could see in her eyes that she was frustrated, and his heart went out to her. He did his best to work it out. "Are you hungry?" Rebecca closed her eyes and opened them slowly. The controlled blink told him that she wasn't hungry. "Does it hurt?" She felt pain, but she wanted to go to the toilet even more, so she blinked slowly again. He seemed to be getting it, so she looked at the bottle of water and did it again. "You want more water?" Rebecca closed her eyes for a long time before she opened them. Kyle was confused for a few seconds. "Do you want to go to the bathroom?" he asked tentatively. Rebecca blinked as quickly as she could, but her joy at being understood quickly disappeared because she realized that he would need to help her pee. He didn't shy away, though, and he carried her to the nearest sand dune. He helped her very matter-of-factly in the face of her embarrassment. "Done?" he asked softly. Rebecca closed her eyes because she didn't want to look at him. Kyle wasn't too bothered because he was just so happy that she was alive. He felt as if he were in a dream, and his joy was indescribable. He hadn't thought twice about having to help her go to the toilet. He was astute enough to realize that she was mortified, and he tried to make it easier for her. "It's all right. When we get married, we'll see every inch of each other. What's so special about this?" She kept her eyes closed and felt anger building inside her. A bit of color returned to her cheeks, which pleased Kyle to no end. He gave her a small smile. "You don't need to be shy anymore. I had to check your entire body for wounds while you were unconscious, so I saw more than that." Her eyes flew open at that, and she looked at him in horror. Kyle beamed at her as his earlier despair finally lifted completely. "There's nothing wrong with your figure. It's fabulous." Rebecca was angry, and she wanted to show him with her fists, but she couldn't move. She could barely even summon the strength to glare. He kissed her on the cheek. "No need to be angry. If you're worried that I took advantage of you, you can take revenge. When you can move again, I'll let you see all of me, okay?" Kyle decided that it wouldn't be safe for them to fly, so he repaired the SUV instead while Rebecca slept. From the map he had downloaded earlier, he could see that they were close to an oasis town, and fortunately, it wasn't in a military zone. He waited for Rebecca to recover slightly and then find a way to get them out of Peru. The sun began drifting beneath the horizon, and he knew the temperature would drop soon. He folded the back seats down to make one large flat surface and cleaned the bloodstains as much as possible. He then carefully carried Rebecca to the car and laid her on the back seat so that she could be more comfortable and stay warm. He lay beside her and cradled her head in his arm. Although he had been awake for a long time, he wasn't sleepy. He ran his fingers through her hair and sighed. A wave of relief washed over him. He had found her. She was alive, and he wasn't alone anymore. Even though her injuries were severe, she was breathing slowly and steadily. Her body was soft, and her muscles were relaxed. She seemed so peaceful. He thought about the medicine that Dr. Shanahan had given to her. It was nothing short of miraculous and had saved her life. She should have been taken to hospital for an operation, and Kyle had panicked when he had found her because he had thought she was going to die. The despair he had felt was unreal. He thought that if she had died, he would have wanted to die too. But Dr. Shanahan's medicine had improved her condition within a few hours. Kyle wondered about the A-grade reagent they had researched at the biomanufacturing facility. His mind began to race, as he considered that the medicine Dr. Shanahan had given Rebecca might be one of the A-grade reagents that had been developed in the same lab he had seen the scientists work on. The medicine was extremely potent and effective, and Kyle suddenly realized that it may have side effects. His thoughts were all over the place, and he couldn't think straight anymore. He gazed at Rebecca and told himself to stop doubting everything. He decided that because Rebecca knew about medication, she would be able to tell if there were harmful side effects. The thought of losing her after just barely saving her life was too much for him to bear. He never wanted to feel that kind of anxiety again. Once in a lifetime was enough. Kyle soon fell asleep. He was mentally and physically exhausted. It was dark and hot in the car. Kyle's eyes flickered open, and he put his hand on Rebecca's forehead. She was burning up with a terrifying high fever. His heart leapt into his throat, and he sat up, wide awake. He quickly rummaged through Rebecca's first aid kit and found a small bottle of pills. The label said the pills could be used for pain, fever, and inflammation. Rebecca was still unconscious, and he pulled her limp body into a seated position to give her the pills. He carefully placed one on her tongue and poured water into her mouth. Then, he gently rubbed her throat to stimulate a swallowing action. He repeated this with the next pill. Her skin was as hot as lava, and beads of sweat had begun to gather on her forehead. He opened the car door carefully, lifted her out, and lay her on the ground, hoping the cold night air would help her cool down. He leaned against the car tire with Rebecca's head on his lap and ran his fingers through her hair. It was quiet in the desert. The sky was clear, and stars sparkled in the distance. 3 stars shone brighter than the rest. Kyle lowered his head and kissed her on the forehead. "Becky, hold on. Keep fighting. Please, don't die." He felt as though his heart would break. Rebecca leaned against him, and for a second, it seemed as if she had responded by softly pressing herself into his chest, but he wasn't sure. It could have been his imagination. Kyle peered into the darkness. "Becky, do you want to hear a song?" Her eyes remained closed, but she reached out her arm ever so slightly, just enough to rest it against his chest. A faint smile crept over Kyle's face, and he closed his eyes as he began to hum a soft, melodic lullaby. Rebecca's body softened as she rested in Kyle's arms. The aching pain in her bones and muscles gradually subsided along with her burning fever. The medication Kyle had given her had started to work, and she fell into a deep, peaceful sleep. Kyle softly sang one lullaby after the next. The deep timbre of his voice was soothing and comforting. He carefully placed his hand on her forehead and was relieved to notice that her fever had broken. The night air was growing colder, so Kyle carefully lifted Rebecca and lay her back in the car. He found a small piece of cloth and dampened it before placing it on her forehead. He then lay down beside her and waited for the sun to rise. Rebecca woke up and swallowed dryly. Her throat, mouth, and lips were so dry that she could hardly make a sound. She rolled her head to the side and saw Kyle. His eyes were closed, and his eyelashes fluttered softly as if he were dreaming. She slowly lifted her hand to touch him. His eyes opened in fright, and he squinted momentarily while trying to remember where he was. "Becky, you're awake. How are you feeling?" Her dry, cracked lips moved slowly, and her voice was hoarse. "Water." She was relieved she could speak again. Kyle leaned over and grabbed a bottle of water from the cup holder in the door panel. He unscrewed it and helped Rebecca sit up enough for her to sip. She drank half the bottle and took a deep breath. "Where are we?" "We're near the Peruvian border. There's an oasis town nearby. I want to get us a change of clothing, and then we can try to cross the border as ordinary civilians seeking refuge from the war." Rebecca kept quiet as she recollected what had happened. She vaguely recalled him saying that a fellow soldier and a doctor had been killed. She saw flashes of her plane veering out of control, and the sound of the instruments warning her rang in her ears. She remembered tugging at the controls and landing the aircraft in a dune. Then she heard Kyle's deep voice singing lullabies in the cool night air. She looked at him with her large almond-shaped eyes. "Are they dead?" Kyle nodded. The sense of grief was overwhelming, and he had to breathe slowly to control his emotions. He gently smoothed her hair as he spoke. "But you're alive, and you need medical attention. We'll leave soon. Hopefully we'll find help in the oasis town." Rebecca sighed and leaned into his arms. She felt a deep sense of sadness that she had never experienced before. She wondered if she had been hallucinating when Kyle had found her after the crash. She was sure she had heard him crying in despair when he had softly confessed his love for her and had held her in his arms. She reached out and put her hand against his chest. "Have you ever cried?" Kyle's body stiffened. "No, never." She gazed at him, puzzled. "I'm sure I heard you crying when you found me." He felt his ears turn red, and he stammered with embarrassment. You did?" "Yeah." She suddenly thought of something and grinned. You also said you want to learn to practice traditional medicine like me. Kyle saw the look of pride in her eyes and felt a faint glimmer of joy in his heart. She was going to be okay. Rebecca was special. She was intelligent and impulsive, and he loved everything about her. Yeah, I'd like you to teach me one day. He lowered his head and kissed her forehead. Teacher Becky. She sighed and stared at the ceiling, but realized she needed to use the bathroom again. Kyle lifted her from the car and carried her a short distance away. He behaved like a perfect gentleman as he helped her without making any crass jokes or making her feel uncomfortable. Rebecca had started to feel a lot better and thought she should be able to cope with a bumpy drive to the oasis town. Let's get going. I read about a plant that only grows in the Atacama Desert. It's a type of succulent known for its healing properties. Let's see if we can find one along the way. The effort it had taken her to go to the bathroom and talk had left her exhausted, and she leaned back against the car seat, feeling weak. Kyle gave her a husk of bread to eat before carefully fastening her seatbelt. He turned the ignition on, and they drove away. They had no choice but to leave the fighter jet in the dune. Kyle closed the hatch and secured it as best he could. He had disabled certain functions and had also removed a critical mechanical component to prevent the enemy from attempting to steal it. The SUV drove across the desert plains, leaving a trail of dust in the air behind it. The wind swept the dust back into the dunes, erasing all traces of Kyle and Rebecca having ever been there. A faint patch of green appeared in the distance and grew larger as they slowly approached it. Rebecca gazed out the window to take in the immense beauty of the desert landscape. She had only ever seen the desert look like that on TV. Succulent plants dotted the landscape, varying in size and shape. Some plants were taller than humans and stood like totem poles under the burning sun. Other plants had tiny flowers blossoming between sharp thorns, as if to remind her that there was always beauty in the world, even though it was sometimes hard to see. She saw a rocky outcrop with a small cluster of bright green succulents and immediately asked Kyle to stop. Look over there. I think that's the plant we're looking for. Kyle engaged four-wheel drive as he slowly maneuvered the SUV along the rocks to get as close as possible. He eventually stopped, unable to drive any further. He got out and carefully lifted Rebecca out of the car. She found standing difficult, so he hooked his arm around her body and picked her up. The muscles in his arms flexed as he carried her toward the cluster of plants. Although the plants all looked the same to Kyle, Rebecca's keen eyes quickly identified the plant she had hoped to find. Here, this is it. Kyle took out his knife and cut a section off. He peeled the skin of the leaf and handed her a chunk of the flesh. She sucked on the plant, noticing that its jelly-like texture seemed ice cold. The plant's soothing properties also appeared to have an immediate effect, and she was sure that the burning pain in her body had started to ease up. She glanced around and took in the beauty of the dry, arid landscape. She shrugged and looked at Kyle sadly. This place is so amazing. It's a pity we can't take any photos. Kyle pulled his phone out of his pocket. He had charged it during the night using a car charger, drawing current from the SUV's battery, and although he didn't have any signal, he could still take photos. He gently sat Rebecca down on a rock in front of a plant without any thorns so she could lean against it. Then he stepped back and took a photo. Her face was pale and she looked gaunt, but her eyes sparkled. He took several photos before sitting beside her to take a selfie of the two of them. She leaned her head on his shoulder and he turned his face slightly to kiss her forehead, stretching his arm out to get both of them in the shot. Rebecca peered at the screen and frowned when she saw her messy appearance. Her hair was scruffy and her clothing was filthy. She wanted to cry. I look awful. No, you don't. I think you're beautiful. He lowered his head and kissed her while pressing down on the screen to take a photo. He kissed her gently. She seemed so fragile and delicate. My little Becky, you're perfect. Rebecca gazed into his dark eyes and heard his voice in the recesses of her memory. It had been dark, and his voice had become hoarse from crying. She had felt his arms trembling as he had held her in a tight embrace, and he had sobbed as he had kissed her. "I liked you already when we were kids. I thought you were beautiful, like a crystal doll. When we got older, I always wanted to take you back home with me. At first, I liked you because you were beautiful. Later on, I liked your intelligence. You're mischievous, kind, and brave. I love you so much, Rebecca." Rebecca stared into the distance in a daze. Her heart began to beat faster as his words echoed in her mind. She sighed weakly. Kyle's eyes suddenly widened. "Becky, are you okay? What's wrong?" She shook her head softly. "Hug me, please." His heart skipped a beat as he put his arms around her body, careful not to hurt her. She turned her head to look up at him and smiled. He gazed back at her and let the warmth of love wash over him. Rebecca leaned closer to whisper in his ear. He immediately recognized her mischievous tone. "I remember something. You held me in your arms when you found me, and my hair got covered in your tears and snot." Rebecca chuckled, not caring that Kyle didn't find her funny. She persistently asked him again, "Did you cry?" He remained silent and slid his phone back into his pocket before lifting her to carry her back to the car. Rebecca happily said that she was feeling much better, but as soon as she leaned against Kyle's broad chest, she could feel her energy levels drop and the burning pain in her body throbbed relentlessly. She had drunk plenty of water to rehydrate and her bladder was full. She tugged at his collar. "I need to go to the bathroom." He stopped dead in his tracks and lowered his eyes. Her face was red as she blushed shyly. The corners of his mouth curled into a naughty smile. "Does little Becky need my help?" Rebecca's eyes widened and she gawked at him. He ignored her shocked expression. She gritted her teeth, annoyed that he would still think it was appropriate to tease her after everything that had happened, and even more so considering her current condition. Her father would have given him a hard smack for being so childish. Kyle turned his head away while Rebecca did what she needed to do. He helped her pull her trousers up and cheekily slapped her bottom. "You've always had a great figure." She glared at him, wishing she had enough strength to punch him. Kyle looked at the fire burning in her eyes and smiled. He had deliberately teased her to make her feel alive and to take her mind off the gravity of their situation. The day he had found her had been one of the worst days of his life, and he had never felt such panic and despair before. He had genuinely thought she was about to die. The fear of losing her had been too much for him, so he had teased her, to reignite the spark in her. He had never thought the day would come when he would become so concerned about personal gains and losses. Kyle carried Rebecca back to the car, noticing she had become weak again. Being out in the hot sun had exhausted her. He reclined the seat to make it more comfortable and strapped the seatbelt over her chest. He got behind the steering wheel, checked the map, and turned back onto the bumpy gravel road. He drove for several miles, constantly watching for anything unusual. Kyle had a keen sense of hearing, and his skin prickled when he heard the sound of another car in the distance. He glanced in his rearview mirror and saw a tiny black speck. He swung off the road and parked behind a large rock, hoping they wouldn't be seen. Rebecca had fallen asleep, and he quickly leaned over to feel her forehead. It was burning hot again, and her fever had returned. Kyle frowned. It wasn't a good sign. It meant that her body was trying to fight off an infection, and his heart sank. He cocked his gun, ready to shoot at any time. The other car had been specially kitted out to handle the rough desert terrain and soon began to close in. Kyle carried Rebecca out of the car, trying to keep them hidden behind the tall cacti growing out of the large rock. The sound of the car grew louder as it approached. Then the noise stopped, and he heard a car door open. Boots crunched on the ground, and Kyle instantly knew they had been seen. He raised his gun, ready to shoot. A man wearing a black uniform with a golden python insignia on the shoulder appeared before them. He held the gun in his hand. Kyle immediately recognized the man as a mercenary from the Golden Python mercenary group, hired by Peru to help them fight against Chile. The man glanced at Kyle and then focused his gaze on Rebecca. "I'm looking for Rebecca." Rebecca had been slipping in and out of consciousness when she heard the familiar voice. She opened her eyes and tried to focus on the man in black standing before them. The man seemed stern and devoid of emotions. "Reggie sent me." Rebecca squinted in the bright sunlight and gasped. "Bruno?" "Yeah." She smiled faintly. "Kyle, it's okay. I know him." Kyle narrowed his eyes. "Becky, he's a mercenary. He's on our enemy's side." She nodded. "It's fine. He's going to help us." Kyle frowned as he carried her out from behind the large rock, keeping his gun in his hand. Bruno's stern face softened when he heard Rebecca speak, and he breathed a sigh of relief. He turned to gaze at Kyle and sized him up. "I've heard about you. It's nice to meet you." He handed his gun to one of his men standing behind him and approached Kyle to shake his hand. "My name is Boyd." Kyle looked at him suspiciously before sliding his gun back into its holster. Bruno was young, probably about the same age as him. He had a thick accent and a dark tan. He had said Reggie had sent him, and Kyle wondered how they knew one another. Kyle looked at the insignias on Bruno's shoulder and realized he ranked high in the mercenary group. He shook Bruno's hand. "Deputy Commander, it's nice to meet you." Bruno turned to look at Rebecca. "Reggie said your aircraft crashed in the dunes and you had been injured. He asked me to find you and rescue you." Rebecca smiled. "Thank you. I can't believe it's you. You're even more handsome than when I last saw you." Kyle frowned and tightened his grip around her. Bruno noticed the jealous look in Kyle's eyes and sighed again. Rebecca was alive. That was all that mattered. He didn't want to waste more time and gestured toward the car. "Let's get out of here. We can talk while we drive. There's an oasis town nearby where we can stop to rest." Bruno's SUV effortlessly glided over the uneven gravel road, and it only took a few hours to reach the small town. Kyle checked his phone and was relieved to have a signal again. The message icon blinked, and he quickly clicked on it. It was a message from Dr. Shenanahan that had been sent the day before. "Kyle, how's Rebecca? Did she take the medicine I gave her?" He raised his eyebrows when he saw that Dr. Shenanahan had used their real names. Instead of texting back, he copied the number from the message and dialed it. Dr. Shenanahan answered almost immediately. He waited for Kyle to explain Rebecca's condition to him. "She needs further treatment. If she took the 3 pills all at once, I'm concerned she'll suffer from severe side effects if I don't do something." Kyle was anxious. "She took the medicine 24 hours ago." "Good. Then we still have enough time." He spoke faster than he usually did. "What's her temperature right now?" "I don't know, but she definitely has a fever. We found a plant in the desert. She ate some and it seemed to help, but that was more than 2 hours ago, and her fever has been climbing ever since." Dr. Shenanahan remained calm. "I know the plant you're talking about. She can keep chewing on it. It'll definitely help." "Thank you, Dr. Shenanahan. I'll get her to you as soon as possible." Kyle hung up and contacted his squad to find out the status of the war. Both sides had suffered considerable losses, and the vicious battle in the air had almost decimated the Peruvian forces. The Chilean troops had pushed back and had victoriously reclaimed much of their territory. Peru had failed to obtain the reagent, and Chile's resistance to their attacks meant the war could become a long, drawn-out affair that neither side could afford. The military leaders had held a peace talk meeting and had eventually agreed on a temporary ceasefire. The two countries had decided to enter into negotiations and had instructed their forces to stand back. Everyone accepted the truce to last for about a week. It suddenly made sense that Bruno could have driven into the desert to look for Rebecca without being attacked. Bruno was familiar with the oasis town and took them to a hotel that his mercenary group had taken control of. He gave Kyle a key to one of the rooms. "Take Rebecca to the room and get some rest. We'll arrange to get her into Chile tomorrow morning." Kyle nodded. "Thank you. I appreciate what you're doing for Rebecca. If you ever need my help, just ask." Bruno smiled with a distant look in his eyes. "Sure. I owed Rebecca. She once saved me, so it was my turn to save her." Although he was speaking about Rebecca, he couldn't shrug off the look he had seen in Layla's eyes when he had sent her back home after rescuing her just a few days earlier. Bruno allocated rooms to his men down the hallway from Kyle and Rebecca. He watched silently as Kyle carried Rebecca to their room. Kyle turned the lock and pushed the door open, holding Rebecca against his chest. The room was well appointed with a velvet couch, a soft double bed, and an en-suite bathroom with a large bathtub. He placed Rebecca on the couch and walked into the bathroom. Rebecca gazed around the room, too weak and exhausted to stand. Kyle turned on the taps and began to run the water. The bathtub was large and would take some time to fill. He hummed softly and returned to the room, unbuttoning his shirt as he opened the wardrobe. 2 white puffy bathrobes hung neatly from hangers with matching slippers slipped into their pockets. He took a bathrobe out and lay it on the bed. Then he removed his shirt, revealing a tight sweat-stained white vest. He peeled the vest off and bent over to take off his boots and socks, tucking them neatly beside the bed. He straightened up and undid his belt buckle before sliding his pants off. He moved swiftly, rolling his soiled clothing and packing it alongside his shoes. Rebecca stared at him, unable to tear her eyes away. At first, she wanted to turn her head, but decided not to. She was silently protesting against him for seeing her when he had checked her for injuries after finding her. She thought she might as well peek at him if he had looked at her. Although sleepy, she wasn't too tired to hold her unblinking gaze. He slid off his boxer shorts, revealing 2 perky buttocks. She also saw an assortment of cuts and bruises all over his body. She realized with shock that he must have injured himself when searching for her after she had crashed her aircraft into the dunes. He had never mentioned anything when he had found her, and she had assumed that he was fine. It hadn't even crossed her mind that he could have been injured. She had even forgotten about the large gash across his back that she had treated with Dr. Shanahan's medicine. The wound had begun to heal well and had already formed a thick scab. She saw Kyle's smooth, well-defined muscles move underneath his tan skin, even with his injuries. His shoulders were broad, and he had a slim, narrow waist. She watched his toned muscles flex and extend as his arms moved. His long legs were straight, with perfectly shaped thighs and calves. Rebecca's breath quickened, and she found him very pleasing to look at. He kept his back to her until he leaned forward to pick up the bathrobe. Then he turned around, swung the bathrobe over his shoulders, slid his arms into it, and began to wrap it around his body as he walked back toward the bathroom. Rebecca squeezed her eyes shut the moment he turned around. She carefully opened them, just enough to form a thin gap to see through. Since she had admired him from behind, she thought she would also take in the full view and admire him from the front. But the hazy figure didn't walk into the bathroom. Instead, it grew larger until Kyle was standing directly in front of her. "Have you seen enough yet?" She sat dead still, wondering if pretending to faint would help. She held her breath. How does he know I've been looking at him? He's had his back to me the whole time, and now my eyes are closed. Kyle chuckled lightly, as if he had read her thoughts. "You seem to forget that I'm a trained combat soldier. I have eyes in the back of my head. I could feel you staring at me. Besides, your eyelashes are fluttering." Rebecca felt her face turn red, and she bit her lip in irritation. He sat beside her and leaned close, his voice low and husky. "Do you want to touch me, too? How about you get the most out of the experience? I don't mind." Her first instinct was to punch him out of frustration, but then she narrowed her eyes as her lips curled into a mischievous grin. She slowly raised her weak hand toward his chest. "Yeah, maybe." Kyle's Adam's apple bobbed up and down, and his eyes widened. She placed her open palm against his ribcage near his heart. Her touch was light, but it felt like an electric shock running across his skin, awakening his deepest desires. She gazed into his eyes as she felt his body tense up. Blinking innocently, she smiled. "You seem to be sweating. Do you feel hot?" Kyle took a deep breath, suddenly regretting his bold move. He had momentarily forgotten that Rebecca could give as good as she got, and he had underestimated her. He swallowed to wet his dry throat. "No, I'm not hot. Yeah, it's hot in here." Rebecca looked at him as if he made perfect sense. "In that case, let me examine you. I'll start by taking your pulse." As she spoke, she slowly slid her hand down his chest toward his waist, stopping at the muscles above his hip bone. He drew in a sharp breath and exhaled slowly. She frowned playfully. "I must be exhausted. I seem to have forgotten how to take a pulse." Speechless, Kyle realized that his innuendo had backfired on him. His heart pounded against his chest as his desire for her coursed through his veins. He shook his head. "She's hurt. You can't. You have to stop. This isn't the right time." He pushed himself up. "I think the bathwater is about to overflow. I'd better go check." He tightened the belt around his bathrobe and strode into the bathroom. He glanced over his shoulder and saw her blushing a deep shade of crimson. She looked at him with her large almond-shaped eyes and quickly looked away again, twirling a loose strand of her hair between her fingers. She nibbled on her bottom lip. Although he sometimes came across as rough around the edges, his handsome face and perfect physique made up for it. Rebecca sighed softly as she heard him turn off the taps and climb into the bath. Kyle groaned as he submerged himself under the water and held his breath. He silently counted to 100, trying to suppress his awakened desire. Her touch lingered on his skin. She's a little vixen. He didn't soak in the bath for very long. He scrubbed his body and washed his hair before pulling the plug and watching the water gurgle down the drain. He dried himself off, rinsed the tub, and ran fresh water for Rebecca. He returned to the bedroom and found her resting her head against a cushion, half asleep, exhausted from teasing him. "Wake up, little Bex. You need to clean yourself off." He leaned over and lifted her with his strong, muscular arms. She was used to him carrying her around, and she breathed in the scent of fresh soap as she leaned against his warm, damp chest. He carefully helped her stand and slowly peeled off her layers of clothing. It was only when she was stark naked that she finally reacted. "Stop staring. Close your eyes." She tried to be fierce, but knew she was powerless and completely reliant on him. He scrunched his eyes shut as he lifted her into the bath and then turned around. "Let me know when you're done washing, and I'll help you with your hair." He left the bathroom, and Rebecca scowled. She hadn't minded too much when Kyle had said he had had to examine her and had seen everything. But now, it seemed like a big deal to her, and she felt she had lost some of her dignity. Her body was dirty. Blood, sweat, and sand clung to her skin, and she rubbed it off with a soapy face cloth. The warm water was soothing, and she began to feel much better. Steam swirled around her as she laid back and closed her eyes. "I should rinse off with clean water." Kyle listened to the soft sounds of water splashing, but became worried when he didn't hear anything more, so he quietly peered around the corner to check on her. He saw her leaning her head against the bathtub. Her delicate face was pink from the warm water, and her lips were slightly parted. Her head was spread around her, and the long strands floated in the water. She had fallen asleep. Her pale skin contrasted against her dark hair, creating a scene reminiscent of a painting by one of the great masters. Kyle drew in a quick breath, spellbound by her beauty. He gazed at her briefly, and then quietly lifted her and wrapped her in a thick towel. He carried her back to the bedroom and sat her on the couch to dry her hair. Rebecca felt the warm air of the hairdryer blowing against her skin, and she opened her eyes. Kyle had been drying her hair and turned it off when she looked up at him with sleepy eyes. She yawned. "I'm hungry." He had already ordered room service while she was in the bath and proudly presented her with a plate of nutritious food, mostly vegetables and starches. It was the best the hotel could offer, considering the circumstances. Kyle fed her one small mouthful at a time. He imagined that they were married and had had a baby. He fancied himself to be good at taking care of a child. Rebecca slowly began to feel better as she ate. Her body was clean and refreshed from soaking in the bath, and her muddled thoughts had become much clearer again. After eating, Kyle lifted her and carried her to the bed. He pulled the sheets back, gently removed the damp towel around her body, and covered her with a soft blanket. "I'll be right back." Rebecca blinked, realizing that she had not a stitch of clothing on. Kyle quickly cleared the table and placed the room service trolley near the door. He was about to walk over to the bed when he heard a knock on the door. He picked up his gun and slid his hand into his bathrobe pocket before peeking through the peephole. A hotel room attendant was standing outside with a bag in his hand. Kyle tightened his bathrobe and opened the door. "Good evening, sir. I brought the clothing you requested." "Thank you." Kyle took the bag and closed the door again. Rebecca propped herself up against a pillow. She frowned, as if something had suddenly occurred to her. "Are we sharing this room tonight?" Kyle was packing the clothing into the wardrobe and turned around with a smile. "Yeah, your friend's quite observant. He only gave me one room key." She looked at him, speechless. "I'll have to give Bruno a piece of my mind later." She was too tired to protest and leaned back in silence. Kyle was exhausted. The last few days had taken their toll on him, and he looked forward to a decent night's sleep. He put his gun on the bedside table, took off his bathrobe, lifted the blanket, and laid down. Rebecca felt the mattress buckle slightly from his weight, and her body stiffened. She could sense the warmth of his body so close to hers and could smell the faint scent of soap on his skin. Although she had always pretended to be innocent and ignorant, she knew that such a situation could lead to something they might regret later. She quickly closed her eyes and lay dead still. The only light in the room came from a small lamp on the table beside the couch, so the room was dim and their figures melted into the shadows. Kyle rolled onto his side to face Rebecca. He felt his heart beat against his ribcage as he gazed at the outline of her delicate face. Her breathing was shallow and her eyelashes trembled. He realized she was nervous and possibly even a bit scared. Nothing like the seductive temptress he had encountered on the couch earlier. He leaned over to hug her. The warmth of her soft, smooth skin sent tingles down his spine, and his senses exploded as his desire for her burned through his entire body. But he knew he had to restrain himself. He lightly rested his arm over her chest and whispered, "I love you, and I can't bear to touch you when you're in this state. I just want to hold you and be close to you. We're going to get you to a doctor tomorrow." Rebecca's body relaxed, and she fell into a deep sleep. Kyle found it even more challenging to control himself than he had expected. He waited a while to be sure she wouldn't wake up, before quietly getting up and taking a cold shower. Rebecca opened her eyes. She was lying in a soft hotel bed with nothing but a sheet to cover her. Kyle was lying beside her, still fast asleep, with his arm draped over her chest. She gazed at his handsome face and listened to his breath's rhythmic rise and fall. Kyle and Rebecca met Bruno in the hotel lobby. They were wearing civilian clothing and looked nothing like the dirty, tired soldiers from the day before. Bruno explained that he had arranged their safe passage across the border into Chile. They drove for a few hours, passing through the land of a cattle farmer whose property ran along the borderline. Only a thin barbed wire fence separated the two countries in the remote desert. They drove for a few miles into the Chilean interior until they were met by a waiting helicopter. Bruno said goodbye to Rebecca and Kyle and watched their helicopter lift into the pale blue sky before turning around to make the long journey back to Peru. The helicopter skimmed over the desert. Rebecca stared out the window and tapped against Kyle's leg when the glistening biomanufacturing facility appeared in the distance. Kyle nodded and held her hand in his. They landed and were met by a group of former colleagues, curious to see who had landed at the base. One of them laughed when they saw Kyle. "Hey, did you guys go on a honeymoon or something?" Another glanced at Rebecca. "What happened?" Kyle's mouth twitched irritably. He wondered who had started the rumor about them going on a honeymoon. He wished they had spent the last few weeks getting married and enjoying a romantic vacation together. Kyle carried Rebecca into the facility and took the elevator to the lab Dr. Shenanahan had told them to go to. It was on the top floor and was one of the high-security labs. Kyle had never been inside that lab. The room was large and neatly set out with shelves of glass containers, high-tech equipment, and shiny steel workbenches. Rebecca's eyes lit up as she glanced around the room. An assortment of equipment usually used to produce traditional medicines, such as oil extractors, lay about. But there were also many other instruments that she couldn't name or think of what they might be used for. She decided on the spot that she would ask Dr. Shananahan to show her around once she had recovered. Dr. Shananahan gestured for Kyle to sit Rebecca down on a steel operating table. Kyle stood beside her and watched as Dr. Shananahan began to examine her. He started by taking her pulse and blood pressure. Luckily, she only ingested 3 pills. He shone a small flashlight in her eyes. She needs a blood transfusion. It'll take about a week for her to regain her strength. She needs to take it easy afterward and may not exercise or return to duty for at least a month. Kyle nodded. Do we need to take her to a hospital? Dr. Shananahan shook his head. No, we'll treat her here. We have everything we need in this lab. He picked up a clipboard and jotted a few notes. His fingers were clean, with neat manicured nails. His pale skin was almost transparent, and his handwriting was tidy, unlike the spidery scribbles doctors generally made. Kyle wondered about Dr. Shananahan and his real identity. His gut told him to be careful, but the scientist's medicine had saved Rebecca from dying. Only Dr. Shananahan knew what was in it and how to treat her against the side effects. It also seemed that Dr. Shananahan had no intention of harming Rebecca, so Kyle told himself to trust him and let him take care of her. As fate would have it, Kyle's phone rang. It was a call from one of his squad members. The war is back on. They have broken the ceasefire agreement and attacked one of our camps during the night. Kyle's brows knitted and his expression became stony. What's the current situation? How far are they from the border? His squad member explained that their reinforcements would arrive by the late afternoon. Kyle sighed. He had to go back. His team needed their captain. Dr. Shananahan seemed to see the reluctance in Kyle's eyes. It's okay. She'll be fine. Kyle nodded hesitantly. She can't walk. It's difficult to move her. The scientist looked at him blankly. She'll be able to move again once I've given her an injection. Okay, I'll leave it up to you. Kyle had no choice. There was no time to waste, and he had to leave immediately. He hugged Rebecca and kissed her forehead. I'll see you soon. As he left the lab, he heard Rebecca talking to Dr. Shananahan. When will I have full mobility again? Only in 3 days. Kyle could hear the confusion in her voice. But how am I to get around? I'll carry you. I'm strong enough. Kyle felt the hairs on his neck stand up, and his immediate reaction was to go back into the lab, but he spun around. He saw the door close and heard the sound of the electric lock as it slid into place. It was a high-security lab, and Kyle knew he couldn't force the door open, no matter how hard he tried. Rebecca's eyes widened with surprise, and she looked at Dr. Shananahan in shock. He chuckled. I have a wheelchair for you to use. It won't be difficult for me to lift you into it. His voice was calm and relaxed. I've already told Katana about you. She'll obediently take care of you when it's necessary. Rebecca nodded, wondering what had happened to Katana for Dr. Shananahan to use the word obediently. Her gut feeling told her that the facility had a mix of people with good intentions and bad. It was difficult to distinguish between the two, and she had already experienced danger hiding in plain sight. But with the situation between the two countries, keeping a low profile and staying alert was the only option. She had to make the best of what she had. The medicine she had taken had saved her life. It was a miraculous medicine just as valuable as the reagent that the two countries were fighting over. Kyle stood outside the doors, livid at what Dr. Shananahan said to Rebecca. The thought of him caring for her the way he had left him feeling uncomfortable and angry. The veins on his forehead began to protrude, and he knocked on the door. The thick acrylic panels muffled the sound of his fist. The doors had a specialized system that made them impenetrable. The original design had been made to stop people from distracting the scientists while they worked, but now it had become like a prison, isolating Rebecca from him. Kyle scowled and was wondering whether he should use the program he had downloaded to destroy the lock system when his phone rang again. "Captain, you have to get back as soon as possible. We've received orders to move out by nightfall." Kyle gritted his teeth and his face darkened. "Yeah, I'm on my way now." He looked at the lab doors and felt as if he were being torn in two. His heart told him to stay with Rebecca, but his sense of duty and responsibility told him he had to go. He sighed and turned away with a heavy heart, hoping Rebecca would be savvy enough to tell if Dr. Shananahan had other intentions. Kyle sat in the helicopter and waited for it to lift into the air before taking his phone out to send Rebecca a message. "Becky, be careful. Don't be fooled. There's something about him. Don't let him touch you for any other reason than to treat you. I love you." He pressed send, but knew the message would only be delivered once they had landed. He also typed a message to Dr. Shananahan. "Rebecca and I are getting married when she turns 20. Will you attend our wedding?" He slid his phone back into his pocket and leaned back. He felt better after sending Dr. Shananahan the message, but the deep frown on his forehead remained. Rebecca read Kyle's message about an hour later. Dr. Shananahan had already given her an injection and she felt drowsy. The scientist saw her slipping to sleep, and he removed the bracelet with the location device that Kyle had given her. Katana appeared with a wheelchair. She stood in the hallway and waited for Dr. Shananahan to carry Rebecca to her. He lifted her as if she weighed no more than a handful of feathers. He didn't strain, and his face showed no signs of discomfort. He gently put her into the wheelchair and straightened up. Rebecca looked at him, puzzled. Kyle was strong and was used to handling heavy items. He had carried her without any effort because of his powerful arms, but Dr. Shananahan didn't appear to be a physically strong person. There were no signs of muscles bulging underneath his white lab coat. Rebecca recalled an article about actors who dramatically carried their female counterparts. While it looked amazing on screen, in reality, the actress was suspended by a thin wire, making her seem light and easy to carry. Dr. Shananahan had had no difficulty lifting her and carrying her across the lab to the wheelchair. He smiled kindly as he set her down, and then returned to his clipboard to jot down another note. In her drowsy state, Rebecca watched him write, and the words flowed like water on the paper. At the hospital near the Chilean border, Reggie was at his father's bedside along with Oliver's men. "It's okay, son. I'll be fine," Oliver reassured him. "Go back to Havana immediately. As soon as my legs heal, I'll be out of here too." Reggie nodded. After an awkward silence, Oliver continued. "I'll take care of Gavin. Just go back and continue your studies. I don't want you to worry about me." They were brought some dinner, and after eating with his father, Reggie received a text message. He broke into a smile when he read it. Oliver looked at him curiously. "I take it you got some good news about Jonathan's daughter." Reggie could hear the bitter tone in his father's voice. "Dad, don't be upset with her. She saved my life after Gavin kidnapped me. She had a terrible accident, but she survived. I should go see her." Oliver sighed. "Son, I just don't want you to get your hopes up. I heard Manuel's son was the one who rescued her in Peru. Their relationship—" Reggie cut him off. "I know what you're trying to say, but she's just a friend. She was injured, and I think going to visit her is the right thing to do. The lab isn't far from here." Oliver felt helpless. He finally nodded. "Okay, I'll arrange a car to take you there." Reggie smiled. "Thanks, Dad." As he walked to the door, he heard Oliver say, "I bet you weren't half as upset when you found out I was injured." Reggie stopped in his tracks. He wanted to offer some sort of explanation, but he couldn't find the words. He decided it was pointless. He knew his father would never understand. Outside the hospital building, he found some bodyguards waiting for him by the car. Everyone knew who he was because of his father's status, so they treated him with the utmost respect. Just then, he saw Calvin walk out. He had been at the hospital for treatment. His condition had improved considerably in the past few days, so the doctors had discharged him. His eyes lit up when he saw Reggie, and he approached him. "Hey, where are you off to?" "The biomanufacturing lab. Rebecca's being treated there." Calvin was surprised. He knew Kyle had gone to search for her in Peru, but he hadn't heard that she had been rescued. "Is she okay? How did she survive the plane crash?" "She's past the critical stage. Dr. Shanahan is caring for her, so I think she'll be fine." "That's good. Well, be careful on your way. I'm off to the front line." 20 minutes later, Calvin was back at base camp, where he was joined by Kyle, who had also arrived at that moment. They gathered with the other members of the squadron to plan their attack. After agreeing on a strategy, Calvin and Kyle walked onto the tarmac where the fighter jets were parked. "I heard you rescued Rebecca," Calvin said. "Reggie told me. I bumped into him when I left the hospital earlier. I didn't realize you used to be classmates in Havana. She saved his life, you know, and she treated me after I was injured. She arranged for him to take me to the medical tent." Kyle frowned. "She saved Reggie? When did that happen?" Kyle didn't notice Kyle's facial expression, so he told him everything that had happened. Kyle became jealous when Calvin told him how Rebecca had saved Reggie. "So he's still here in Chile?" Calvin nodded. "Yeah, his father was wounded. He was with him at the hospital earlier, but he told me that he was going to the lab to visit Rebecca. Dr. Shanahan's treating her. That man must be an evil genius. It was because of that reagent he and his team developed that the war broke out. So many people have lost their lives." But Kyle wasn't listening anymore. He was thinking about Reggie going to visit Rebecca. They arrived in front of their fighter jets, and he forced himself to forget about Reggie and concentrate on the battle they were about to fight. The members of his squadron were men and women who had fought alongside for years, so they immediately noticed that something was off with their captain. He wasn't his usual self as they flew off to join the battle, and they were nervous about what would happen when their enemies arrived. They were counting on Kyle to avenge the deaths of their fellow members and give their opponents a run for their money. They had had enough of the war, and they just wanted to return home as soon as possible. Luckily, the battle ended even before it began. Peru's consortium had discovered that their plan had been foiled. The reagent the biomanufacturing lab had developed was already on its way to the U.S., so it was too late for them to do anything. They quickly surrendered, and the two countries began to negotiate peace terms. Kyle's squadron returned to base camp, and he got into a helicopter to fly to the lab immediately after. 3 days had passed since Kyle had taken Rebecca to the biomanufacturing facility for treatment, and she felt much better. She had regained her ability to move, and she was happy to be the willing subject of Dr. Shanahan's experiments. She lay on the table in the lab, watching the doctor as he pottered about the room. She couldn't believe she had been stuck in a wheelchair just 2 days earlier, feeling tired and weak. That day, she was more energetic and eager to learn more about what he was doing. Her phone vibrated in her pocket, and she took it out. It was a message from Kyle, telling her that the war was over and that he was on his way to see her. She hastily replied, "There's no hurry. I'm in the lab with Dr. Shanahan, and I'm afraid I won't be able to leave for a while." Kyle, who was already in the helicopter, scowled when he read her message. Rebecca went back to watching the doctor. Chemistry was an area she wasn't particularly familiar with, though she had always been interested in it. However, she was interrupted by her phone's vibration once again. "Now what?" she muttered, looking at the screen. It was a message from her mother. "Callum's doing much better. He's gotten his memory back, and he's his old self again. We're all very relieved." She broke into a wide smile. In New York, the Davis house was bustling with activity. The weather was warm, and the days were getting longer. It was still light out when Wanda left school. She had been thrilled to hear that Callum was better, so she hurried over to see him. Nancy had invited all her son's friends over for dinner, hoping that seeing familiar faces would help his recovery. Everyone was already there when Wanda arrived. She heard animated chatter in the living room as soon as she entered the house. She felt a bit nervous about seeing Callum after so long. Nancy had told her that he slept a lot and that he still sometimes had trouble remembering the past. Wanda felt sorry for him, but she was relieved that he had finally recovered from his amnesia. She took a deep breath and walked into the living room. She saw the identical twins sitting on the couch, but she instantly knew which one was Callum. Tristan was working at his father's company, and he had left the office that afternoon as soon as his mother had called him to tell him the good news about Callum. He was still wearing his suit. Wanda thought he looked very dapper and professional, though he still had an aloofness about him that she didn't find particularly attractive. Callum, who was wearing a pair of jeans and a t-shirt, was sitting beside him, looking relaxed and happy. Beau was admiring the phone in Callum's hand. "Is that the latest model?" Callum nodded. "Yeah, my parents got it for me. Want to play a video game?" Just then, he noticed Wanda, who was standing there shyly. He smiled as he looked her up and down. "Hey, it's good to see you. You've gotten taller since I last saw you." She blushed, not knowing what to say. Tears welled up in her eyes. Callum could tell she was emotional, though she was trying her best to conceal it. It was an awkward moment. He got up, walked over to her, and caressed her cheek. "Hey, what's with the sad face? Did someone die?" She couldn't hold it back any longer. She threw herself into his arms and promptly burst into tears. Callum held her for a while, and then he turned to Beau. "What's with her? Didn't you take care of her while I was gone? Looks like you didn't do a very good job." Beau held up his hands in protest. "Don't blame me. I did my best to console her in your absence. Just ask Tristan." He looked at the other twin imploringly. "Tell him that I never bullied her or did anything to upset her. You should know. You're the one that's been helping her with her schoolwork during your free time. My mother tells me she's going to get into a top university." Tristan just nodded. Wanda wiped away her tears, trying to regain her composure. She looked up at Callum. "Everyone took excellent care of me, especially Tristan. My grades have improved, and I'm at the top of my class." Callum smiled. "That's great news. I'm so proud of you." Just then, Tristan's phone rang, and he left the room to take the call. Callum turned to Beau and Luke. "Care to go outside and play a little game of basketball before dinner?" Beau nodded enthusiastically. "You're on. I've been playing a lot lately. Get ready for some serious competition." He motioned to his brother to join them. Tristan returned. When he found out they were playing basketball, he ran upstairs to change his clothes. Callum grabbed Wanda's hand. "Come on, you can cheer us on." Wanda nodded excitedly. "I'd love to watch you guys play." She left the house with Callum, Beau, and Luke, and they walked over to the basketball court on the other side of the yard. Tristan joined them a few minutes later after changing into a pair of sweatpants and a t-shirt. He handed Wanda a soda. "Here, in case you get thirsty." She smiled and thanked him. He nodded politely, and then he jogged onto the basketball court. Beau gestured to his brother. "Luke and I will team up against you two. You better watch out, though. I'm pretty good." Wanda laughed, wondering why men were always so competitive when it came to sports. Even Tristan, who was usually so calm and aloof, was excited. He puffed out his chest, determined to win the match. She watched as they ran around the court, throwing hoops. She was surprised by how skilled Tristan was. He had never seemed like the sporty type to her, but he scored almost every time. Wanda cheered for both teams, though she secretly hoped Tristan and Callum would win. She sipped her soda as she yelled words of encouragement to all of them. Beau threw the ball through the hoop. Callum then grabbed it and threw it to Tristan, who dribbled the ball on the spot for a while, carefully aimed for the hoop, and scored. It was a textbook dunk. Beau shook his head in disbelief. "No way! When do you find time to play? You must practice every day." Beau had been training hard ever since the day that Callum had returned home and, not having remembered any of them, beaten them all up. Even his sister had complimented him on his muscular physique. The girls at university had noticed too, and he had plenty of admirers. But he hadn't expected the Davis twins to be so fit as well. Luke punched his brother playfully on the arm. "Stop talking and concentrate on the game." After an hour, they left the court, exhausted. Wanda handed them each a towel and a bottle of water. Callum winked as he wiped the sweat from his face. "So, which team won?" She pretended to think hard for a while. "I think it was even. I lost count after a while." They laughed, knowing she was just saying that to make them feel good, but they didn't care. It had been a fun game. After stretching their sore muscles, they returned to the house. Callum turned to Wanda. "Do you remember that trophy I gave you after the race? It's up in my room if you still want it." Wanda was pleased that he remembered that he had given it to her. "Of course I do." "Come on, let's go get it." She followed him up the stairs to his bedroom. He removed the trophy from his display cabinet and handed it to her. "Take good care of it. I'll give you something else next time." "Thanks." She recalled the day he had won the competition, and she suddenly felt sad about all that he had been through since then. She covered her face with her hands so he wouldn't notice the tears in her eyes, but he did. "What's wrong?" "Nothing. I think there's something in my eye." He took her hand away from her face and gently lifted her chin. "Let me take a look." Callum's face was so close that Wanda could feel his breath on her face. He had his index finger and thumb on her chin, and she felt a wave of excitement rush through her. She didn't dare move. She had that familiar feeling she had had months ago before he had disappeared. His hand was rough, and she noticed that it had calluses. It was such a sharp contrast to her soft, delicate skin. Her heart was racing in her chest, and she suddenly felt nervous by his proximity. She broke into a cold sweat as he leaned in closer to examine her eye. She turned red with embarrassment. "I think it must be an eyelash." But Callum didn't say anything. Wanda tried to look away, but his face was right in front of her. She noticed how sharp his features were. His nose was almost touching hers at that moment. She held her breath as his lips parted. She was sure he was about to kiss her. But then he moved away all of a sudden. He shrugged his shoulders. "I don't see anything. Try blinking a few times." She was stunned, not knowing whether to be relieved or disappointed. She was about to say something when she noticed his sudden behavior change. The veins on his forehead bulged, and beads of sweat ran down the side of his face. She looked down at his hands, which were clenched into fists. Instinctively, she reached out and grabbed his arm. "Callum, what's wrong? You look unwell." He looked at her with a coldness that made her shudder. He then slapped her hand away aggressively. Before she could react, he pushed her to the floor. She screamed with fright and got up, but he grabbed her around the waist before she could escape. His eyes had a wild look in them, as if he were struggling with himself. Wanda was so scared that her legs suddenly gave away. She tripped, hitting her foot on a table, and she fell forward onto his bed. Callum stood watching her for a moment, trembling. Then he staggered toward her, caught his foot on the rug, and fell on top of her. She screamed again. She tried to climb out from underneath him, but his entire weight was on her. She felt like she couldn't breathe. He put his hand on her mouth to keep her from yelling. Wanda started sobbing. She had never been so frightened in her entire life. All she could see was Callum's angry face in front of her. She tried to push him away, but he was too strong for her. He pinned her arm to the bed with one hand while he covered her mouth with the other. She moved her head to and fro, but it was no use. She felt helpless, hoping someone would walk into the room and save her. Time stood still as Wanda struggled underneath Callum's weight on the bed. She felt like she was going to suffocate as he held her down. After a while, he rolled off her and lay there gazing at her as if nothing had happened. He smiled at her in a way that sent shivers down her spine. She moved away from him, afraid of what he would do next. He finally broke the silence. "I think I've seen you before." Wanda was stunned. She had no idea what was going on with him. He had seemed so friendly and relaxed earlier, but at that moment, He was an entirely different person. She cleared her throat. "And what do you remember about me?" She was afraid of the answer. She didn't think Callum had recovered at all, despite what Nancy and his other family members seemed to think. She held her breath as she waited for him to respond. He shrugged. "I think you were here in my room last time I saw you." He sized her up, and his gaze landed on her breasts. "You're quite flat-chested, you know that?" Wanda felt as if someone had poured a bucket of cold water over her. She couldn't believe someone could be so nasty. He wasn't at all the Callum that she knew. Her eyes filled with tears. He reached over to wipe them away and looked at the teardrop on his finger with disgust. He had an expression she had never seen before. "I hate it when women get emotional. It's a sign of weakness. I like a strong woman who aims to please. If you think crying's gonna help, think again." He got up and glared at her. "Get out of here. You're not my type." Wanda didn't have to be told twice. She jumped off the bed and ran out of the room. Everyone was in the living room when she suddenly rushed in, sobbing uncontrollably. Bo jumped to his feet. "Wanda, what's wrong? Did Callum do something to you?" Tristan stared at her in horror, and then he ran toward the stairs. Jonathan, who had been chatting with Xavier in the kitchen, heard the commotion and went over. "What happened?" Wanda fought back tears. "It's Callum. He's not himself. He changed into that horrible person again." Jonathan's face froze, and he ran up the stairs after Tristan. Nancy put her arm around Wanda's shoulders to comfort her. "I'm so sorry, dear. We thought he was doing better. What happened? Did he hurt you?" Wanda shook her head. "I'm okay, but he scared me half to death. It's like he was an entirely different person. He was saying some very nasty, humiliating things to me." She didn't go into the details about what had really happened since she felt embarrassed about it, and she didn't want Nancy to know that her son could be so violent. But Nancy was still worried. She stood at the bottom of the stairs, waiting for Jonathan and Tristan to appear. Bo wanted to see what was going on, but his father stopped it. Jonathan and Tristan finally emerged from Callum's room a quarter of an hour later, looking dejected. Jonathan took his phone out and made a call. Rebecca was still in the lab with Dr. Shananahan when Kyle called her to say he had arrived. She told him to go to the canteen and get something to eat until they finished the experiment. She was having too much fun watching the doctor's careful, deliberate movements as he mixed various formulas. Kyle was disappointed. He had hoped she would be excited to see him, but she had sounded cold and distant over the phone. Roma went up to him when she saw him standing in the hallway. "Hey, Kylan. Long time no see. Are you growing a beard?" He touched his face. He had been so busy fighting battles the past few days that he hadn't had time to shave, and he had been so eager to see Rebecca that he hadn't even bothered to shower and put on clean clothes. He stared at the locked door leading to the high-security lab, realizing that she wouldn't be out for a while. He saw Roberto and asked him if he had a razor. Roberto looked at him suspiciously. He didn't trust Kyle after he had beaten him up, but he didn't want any trouble, so he went over to the storage cabinet and found a razor. After thanking him, Kyle went to the bathroom to tidy himself up. He washed his face, shaved, and combed his hair. He looked at his reflection in the mirror with satisfaction. He threw the disposable razor away and walked back into the hallway. Inside the lab, Dr. Shananahan had just finished preparing his latest formula. He was satisfied with Rebecca's progress. Though she hadn't completely recovered from her injuries and was still weak, she was able to walk. After he had synthesized the reagent, she helped him clean up. He handed her the bottle he had prepared. "Take this with you. You may need it." Her eyes lit up. "Are you sure?" He nodded. She smiled and thanked him several times as they got ready to leave. Just then, her phone rang. She was expecting the call to be from Kyle, but it was her father. "Hi, Dad. What's up?" "Your brother's not well, Pumpkin. We thought he had recovered, but he still has traces of his alter ego, and his amnesia comes and goes. He just had another episode a few minutes ago. I'm not sure what to do." He told her what had happened, and then he sighed. I've looked into Dr. Shanahan's credentials, and he checks out. I think we'll need his help with Callum." Rebecca turned to look at the doctor, who was taking off his lab coat. "Okay, I'll talk to him." Dr. Shanahan was aware that Rebecca was talking about him. He waited for her to finish her conversation and hang up. "Talk to me about what?" She pursed her lips as they left the lab. "My dad wants to speak to you about my brother, Callum. When would be a good time?" She gave him her most winning smile. Kyle was just outside, waiting. When he saw her flirting with the doctor, he became incredibly jealous. Rebecca didn't realize that Kyle was just outside the lab and that he had seen her and Dr. Shanahan. She was too busy smiling at the doctor and trying to convince him to speak to her father. But Dr. Shanahan saw Kyle. He smiled back at Rebecca. "Any time this evening is fine." She was relieved. "That's great. Thank you so much." It was then that she noticed Kyle standing there with a frown on his face. Her eyes lit up, and she waved at him enthusiastically. He suddenly felt as if a weight had been lifted. She was genuinely pleased to see him. He approached them, and he held his hand out to the doctor. "Hello, Dr. Shanahan." The doctor shook his hand, and then he turned to Rebecca. "By the way, I heard you're getting married soon. Congratulations. Have you set a date?" She was taken aback. "Really? That's strange since no one's proposed to me. Where did you hear that?" Kyle, who was standing behind Rebecca, scowled at him. She became indignant. "I don't know who's been spreading such rumors. I don't intend to get married for a while. There's no rush." Dr. Shanahan gave Kyle a knowing smile. "Oh, I may have misheard then. Perhaps I mixed you up with someone else. My apologies." Kyle turned red with embarrassment, but Rebecca didn't seem to notice. She gave him a big hug, and then she examined him closely. She sighed with relief to see that he was well and in one piece. They walked to the elevator and got in. Rebecca asked Dr. Shanahan if he wanted to join them for lunch. He shook his head. "I have some work to finish up. You two go ahead. Kyle must be starving by now. Give your father my number and tell him he can call me any time." She nodded and thanked him again as he got off on the first floor. She then glanced at Kyle and noticed that he was grumpy, but she was too busy thinking about Callum. They got out on the ground floor and headed to the canteen. Kyle gave her a knowing look to indicate that they should still play the part of their aliases, and she nodded in reply. Katana and Shane were also there and sat with them. Katana was especially animated that day. She wasn't aware that Rebecca knew about her and Jeremy, and she felt closer to Rebecca since she had taken care of her that past week. The two women chatted with Shane while Kyle sat in silence. He hated small talk and felt he had nothing to add to the conversation. Rebecca tried to engage him, but his replies were curt, and it was obvious that he wasn't interested. Katana and Shane didn't seem to notice, thinking he was just tired after a long morning. After they left, Rebecca turned to Kyle, and she saw the angry look on his face. He grabbed her hand, but it was more out of possessiveness than genuine affection. She knew he had a hard time warming up to people, but he had never behaved like that with her before. "Kyle, you've been acting strange ever since you got here. What's the matter?" Rebecca was right about Kyle's odd behavior. Aside from being jealous, he was upset that Dr. Shanahan had hinted at the text he had sent him a few days earlier about marrying her. When he saw Rebecca's worried expression, he shrugged it off. "Nothing's wrong. I'm just a bit tired." He squeezed her hand lovingly and kissed her on the forehead. They were still in the canteen, which was quite busy, so everyone saw their intimate moment. Rebecca felt embarrassed. She wasn't particularly keen on public displays of affection. She pulled away. "Kyle, everyone can see us. We shouldn't be so comfortable with each other in public." "I don't care." He caressed her cheek with his rough hand. "Are you feeling better? You've made a lot of progress since I left you here." She nodded. "Yes, Dr. Shanahan's been great. I was able to get out of my wheelchair and walk around after only 2 days. His medication was very effective." Kyle scowled. He was tired of hearing about the doctor all the time, and he hated the fact that Rebecca had been flirting with him earlier, even though he knew he couldn't do anything to stop it. He bit his lower lip. You shouldn't be complimenting other men so much. Rebecca was taken aback by his comment, and she suddenly realized what his problem was. She burst out laughing. Kyle, are you jealous again? He had no problem admitting the truth. You're constantly surrounded by admirers. I heard Reggie came to see you the other day. Yes, he was here. He wanted to see how I was doing. We talked for a while and then he left. It was no big deal. She smiled tenderly at him. Why are you so threatened by him? Is it because he's a few years younger than you? Don't be ridiculous. I just want to make sure my future wife is faithful to me. Rebecca raised her eyebrows. Future wife? How dare you assume I'm going to marry you? We shared a bed together the other night. Didn't that mean anything to you? She blushed, but she was indignant. Were you the one who told Dr. Shanahan that we'll be getting married soon? Have you already set a date and booked the venue? Because I don't remember you proposing to me. Kyle looked at her with a hurt expression, but he didn't say anything. In the future, please check with me before you go around spreading rumors. It was you who told him, wasn't it? Don't deny it. He still refused to answer. He clenched his fists, and his jaw was taut. She laughed again. I bet you told him we were getting married because you were worried about him making a move. How could you be so childish? You can be so cute when you're jealous, my little green-eyed monster. Kyle turned pale, and he gave her a threatening look. So you find all this funny, do you? She nodded, wiping the tears from her eyes. I do. I've never met anyone like you. She could sense that he was furious, but she couldn't stop laughing. She waved her hand and tried to speak through gasps of laughter. I can't take it anymore. I can't catch my breath. Kyle was suddenly worried about her because she was still recovering, and he didn't want anything to happen to her. So he gently rubbed her back and tried to get her to calm down and breathe. That evening, Jonathan called Dr. Shanahan. He explained that they had tried everything with Callum, but his condition didn't seem to be improving. Helga had also examined him, but she hadn't been able to help since his problem was psychological and not physical. She had given him some herbal remedies, but nothing had worked. At that moment, Callum was still Chester, his alter ego. Although he wasn't violent, he had a dark, menacing look in his eyes, and Jonathan and Nancy were afraid he would eventually do something terrible. He was unruly and seemed to hate everyone around him. Dr. Shanahan told him that there was no knowing how much of the reagent Callum had been exposed to when he had been in the lab, because Jeremy had used it without permission. Your son may still be suffering from the side effects. I'm going to need a sample of his blood to determine what's causing the problem, Mr. Davis. It's difficult for me to give you a thorough assessment without it. Jonathan told him he would get someone to take a vial of Callum's blood to the biomanufacturing facility as soon as possible, and he thanked him. The following day, Rebecca went back to the lab to see Dr. Shanahan, while Kyle returned to the base camp. He had been reluctant to leave her behind, even though it was only for a short time. So he had her promise that there was no one else in her life but him. Satisfied with her declaration of love, he had left early that morning after escorting her to the lab. Meanwhile, Norman was on his way to Chile after having taken a sample of Callum's blood the night before. As soon as he arrived at the facility late that evening, Dr. Shanahan analyzed the sample. Rebecca watched him closely, hoping he would find the cause of and the remedy for her brother's strange behavior. 2 hours later, he asked her to accompany him to his office, where he printed out several reports of his findings. He sat down in his chair and furrowed his eyebrows. Rebecca held her breath as she waited for the diagnosis. There was a long silence before he finally told her what the results were. Your brother's condition is serious, but it's treatable. You and your family will have to be patient, though, because it's going to take a very long time for him to recover. She sighed with relief. So that means there's hope, right? He's going to get better and go back to being his old self? How long will it take? The nerves in his brain have been damaged, and that's difficult to fully recover from. I would say 3 to 5 years at most, but with proper treatment, if he's lucky, it can be as short as 1 year. However, he'll need to come to the lab so I can treat him and monitor his progress. It can't be done remotely, I'm afraid. I may need to adjust his medication occasionally, depending on how he reacts. His diagnosis was much better than Rebecca had expected. Her father had taken Callum to countless experts in New York, but none of them had been able to help. Even Helga had been clueless about possible treatments, despite all her knowledge and experience. And there were no previous case studies in any of the medical books. You're a saint, Dr. Shanahan. I'm going to call my father right away and tell him the good news. When should they send Callum over? The sooner the better, before his alter ego takes over completely. We need to begin treatment immediately. Otherwise, he may reach the point of no return. Rebecca nodded, and she excused herself so she could call her father. The following day, Jonathan, Tristan, and Callum boarded a private plane to Chile. Another year passed in the blink of an eye, and a lot happened. Rebecca and Kyle had been deployed to several countries and had successfully provided rescue and relief support to people in the worst conditions. They had seen unimaginable horrors and had become more resilient to the hardships of war as they had matured into outstanding soldiers. The Chilean biomanufacturing facility's reagent had created an economic windfall for all the stakeholders involved and had changed the pharmaceutical industry's future on an international level. The facility attracted the industry's most esteemed experts as it expanded its production of the specialized and groundbreaking reagents. Reggie and Rebecca had kept in contact, sending goodwill messages during the holidays, but they hadn't seen each other again. Layla had recovered from the trauma of being caught amid a brutal war and had thrown herself into university life. She had joined the student council and had made many friends. She and Sean had formed a strong relationship and were often teased for being the perfect couple. Bruno had been promoted to general after his predecessor had passed away, making him one of Mr. K's right-hand men. Callum had undergone extensive treatment, and it seemed as though his original personality had once again become the dominant one. His second personality seldom showed itself anymore and had been pushed into his deepest memories. A light aircraft landed at a private airport on the outskirts of New York City. A slender young man with strikingly handsome features stepped down from the plane and squinted his eyes in the bright sunlight. There was a sense of cynicism and unruliness about him. Rebecca had been waiting for a long time, and her face lit up when she saw him. She beamed and hurried toward him with outstretched arms. Callum smiled and opened his arms wide to embrace her. Tristan ran toward him, grinning from ear to ear. Callum laughed as he hugged his siblings. It's so nice to see you two. Long time no see. Rebecca wiped a tear from her cheek. Yeah, you could say that again. She had been busy on active duty for the better part of the year, and her only holiday had been over the New Year break, but they hadn't been able to visit one another. Tristan had visited Callum at the biomanufacturing facility a few times, but had only seen his brother's original personality once. He was thrilled to have him back. Hey, little brother. So, are you going to come back and stay for good or what? I'm going to study. I've already sent my application to a few universities abroad. Tristan frowned. But what about NYU? Callum shrugged. I researched a lot about cars while I was undergoing treatment. His eyes glistened as he spoke. I'm interested in the Davis Group's recent collaboration with the Smoku Corporation. They shifted their focus to researching and developing new types of cars. It's right up my alley, and I've been working on several designs already. I need the technical and theoretical training, so I've sent my application to some universities offering the right courses. Tristan and Rebecca nodded. They knew exactly what he meant, but Callum still had a few obstacles to overcome. Rebecca looked at him quizzically. What about your treatment? Didn't Dr. Shanahan say it would take at least another couple of years? Callum's carefree smile said it all. Yeah, I'll fit it all in. I mean, I'm just going to be studying. I won't be doing anything crazy. Rebecca narrowed her eyes. Yeah, okay. But does Dad know about this? Tristan and Rebecca stole knowing glances at each other as they climbed into the car. Callum chatted away excitedly. It's only 4 years, and then I'll show you my groundbreaking designs. It'll be just like Mom and Dad back in the old days. As they drove away, all three sat in silence, thinking of the stories they'd heard about Jonathan and Nancy before they had had kids. It was hard to believe how much that had happened to their family and friends in the years since their parents met. But through it all, one thing had remained unchanged. The fierce, undying love that united them, and always would. This episode marks the end of the show, A Wife's Revenge.